There is a fossil that no one alive has ever seen in full. It has been pulled from 3 different continents in fragments, reconstructed in plaster and educated guesswork, argued over in journals and conference rooms for more than a century, and still, despite everything we have learned about it, there is no consensus on what it actually looked like standing in the light of a Cretaceous afternoon. That animal is Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, and the story of what it was and what it was not, and what it reveals about the world it shared with creatures like Tyrannosaurus Rex, is one of the strangest and most contested stories in the entire history of paleontology. Because this is not really a story about 2 animals, it is a story about 2 worlds, 2 completely different versions of the Mesozoic, separated by geography and time and ecology and 30 million years of unshared history, that happened to produce, on opposite ends of the Earth, the 2 largest land predators that ever lived. And the question of which one ruled is not the question you think it is. Most people, when they hear the names Tyrannosaurus Rex and Spinosaurus, immediately reach for the same mental image. 2 enormous predators circling each other on a dusty plain, teeth bared, the earth trembling beneath their weight. Is the image sold by documentaries and action figures and the particular kind of childhood wonder that never entirely leaves us? It feels like a natural question. They were both enormous. They were both carnivores. Surely one of them was more powerful, more dominant, more perfectly suited to the business of predation, and surely the fossil record has an answer. But here is what almost no one stops to consider. These animals never met. Not once, not ever, in any version of reality. They were separated not just by thousands of kilometers of open ocean and continental drift, but by something even more unbridgeable than geography, by time itself. Tyrannosaurus Rex walked the Earth roughly 66 to 68 million years ago. Spinosaurus, in its fully developed form, lived closer to 95 to 100 million years ago. They missed each other by roughly 30 million years, a gap so wide that it encompasses the entire span of primate evolution, up to and including the emergence of modern humans, and then doubles it. The question of which one would win a fight is, in a very literal sense, a question with no possible answer. But the deeper question, the one that actually illuminates something real about how life works, about how evolution shapes bodies and behaviors and ecological roles, is something else entirely. What kind of world produced each of these animals, and what does that world tell us about what they actually were? So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this kind of deep, slow exploration is something you genuinely enjoy. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. These stories seem to travel to some unexpected places, and I'm always glad to know how far. Now dim whatever lights are still on. Let the day go quiet around you. And come with me back into a world that existed long before the first human hand ever held a stone. Long before the first flowering plant opened toward a Cretaceous sky. Back into the age of enormous, impossible, beautiful animals whose bones we are still learning to read. There is something unusual about the way this particular question has captured the human imagination, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Children argue about it in schoolyards. Adults revisit it with a kind of sheepish nostalgia, the way you return to a puzzle that entranced you at 10 and find that it is still, somehow, genuinely interesting. Tyrannosaurus Rex versus Spinosaurus. It has all the ingredients of a myth, 2 titans, 2 different shapes of power, the suggestion of an inevitable confrontation. But myths are not history, and the fossil record is not a tournament bracket. What the bones actually tell us is far more interesting than any imagined battle, because they tell us about 2 completely different solutions to the problem of being a very large predator. 2 different strategies written in calcium and cartilage, and evolutionary time, shaped by climates and ecosystems that no human being ever saw or ever could have seen. To understand either of these animals properly, you have to understand the world that made them. And to understand those worlds, you have to go back much further than the animals themselves, back to the Mesozoic era in its full, strange, humid, reptile-saturated reality, and try to see it not through the lens of a child's imagination, but through the lens of what the rocks and the bones and the isotopes actually preserve. The Mesozoic era, that vast span of time running from roughly 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago, is often talked about as though it were a single thing, a long warm epoch of dinosaurs and ferns and shallow inland seas. But this is like talking about the last 250 million years of Earth's future, as though they will all be the same. The Mesozoic had its own internal revolutions, its own shifting continents, its own waves of extinction and radiation, and ecological reinvention. The world of the early Triassic, when the first dinosaurs were experimenting with bipedalism on a still-smoking post-apocalyptic landscape, was nothing like the world of the late Cretaceous, when flowers had transformed the appearance of every continent and mammals were already diversifying in the undergrowth. These were different Earths, and between them, in the middle of that story, in a period called the Cretaceous, two lineages of enormous predatory dinosaurs rose to ecological dominance in ways that were, upon examination, almost exactly opposite to each other in nearly every important respect. Let us begin with Spinosaurus, because in many ways it is the stranger of the two, the one whose reality departed most dramatically from what we assumed for most of the 20th century, and the one whose story contains the more recent and more shocking reversals of scientific expectation. To understand Spinosaurus, you have to understand where it lived. And where it lived was a place so unlike anything that exists on Earth today that describing it requires you to set aside almost every reference point you have for what a landscape looks like. Travel back approximately 95 to 100 million years, to a period geologists call the Cenomanian Age of the Cretaceous. The continent we now call Africa did not yet exist in its modern form. What would become the Sahara Desert, that vast, pale, sun-hammered expanse of sand and stone that covers more than 9 million square kilometers of the modern world, was at this moment something almost precisely opposite. It was a vast, warm, low-lying floodplain, threaded with enormous rivers and shallow tidal waterways, edged by mangrove-like forests, and stretching for hundreds of kilometers under a sky heavy with moisture. Paleontologists call this lost ecosystem the Kem beds, named for the geological formation in what is now southeastern Morocco and western Algeria, where many of its fossils have been found. But the Kem was not unique to that corner of the world. Similar fluvial and estuarine environments stretched across what would become Egypt, Sudan, Niger, and beyond, a whole wet, sprawling, thermally extreme world sitting at low paleolatitude, baking in equatorial heat, perpetually drenched by the kind of seasonal flooding that modern ecosystems like the Amazon floodplain only partially approximate. Imagine walking into that world. The air is heavier than anything you have experienced, not just warm but saturated. The kind of humidity that turns your clothing to a second skin within minutes and makes the horizon shimmer. The ground beneath you is soft in places, dark sediment laid down by rivers that shift their courses seasonally across a flat, swampy plain. The vegetation is not the lush green canopy of a modern tropical forest. There are no flowering trees in this part of the world yet, or very few. What you see instead are conifers, cycads, tree ferns, and low-growing horsetails crowding the muddy banks of waterways that extend to the limits of vision. The water itself is warm and murky, moving slowly, carrying with it the chemical signatures of enormous organic productivity. And in that water, and along its edges, and in the air above it, is life on a scale that modern ecosystems cannot easily match. because the predators here were not the familiar lions and crocodiles and eagles of the modern world. They were something larger, stranger, and in several cases entirely without modern equivalents. The Kem-Kem ecosystem is one of the most predator-dense environments ever documented in the fossil record. This is itself a puzzle, because ecological theory tells us that apex predators should be relatively rare compared to their prey, and yet the Kem-Kem has produced an almost embarrassing abundance of large predators relative to the herbivores we know about. The sauropod dinosaurs that browsed the floodplains were enormous. Animals like Rebbachisaurus and its relatives, long-necked titanosaurs capable of reaching vegetation that no other animal could access. Their footprints pressing deep impressions into the soft sediment of riverbanks. Iguanodonts and other ornithopods moved in groups across the drier margins of the plain, but alongside these herbivores, and apparently in great numbers, were the predators. There were multiple large theropod dinosaurs occupying this ecosystem simultaneously. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, a theropod approaching or possibly exceeding Tyrannosaurus in length, hunted here. Deltadromeus, a gracile, long-limbed theropod whose exact affinities are still debated, moved through this environment as well. Large Notosuchian crocodilians occupied the waterways alongside enormous fish. Onchopristis, a sawfish with rostral teeth like curved ivory blades, grew to lengths that rival the largest modern sharks. And above all of them, in terms of sheer physical presence, was Spinosaurus. But what was Spinosaurus exactly? For most of the 20th century, the answer seemed relatively clear, if tantalizingly incomplete. The animal had first been described by German paleontologist Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach in 1915, based on fossils recovered from the Bahariya Formation in Egypt by Richard Markgraf, beginning around 1910. Those original fossils included parts of the vertebrae, some jaw fragments, and enough material to suggest a very large theropod with extraordinarily tall neural spines projecting upward from its backbone, forming what appeared to be a dramatic sail or crest of skin and bone along the animal's dorsal surface. The tallest of these spines, based on the material Stromer described, reached approximately 1.5 meters in height. The animal itself appeared to rival or exceed Tyrannosaurus in length. Stromer estimated it at roughly 15 meters. His description, published in the German scientific literature during the First World War, attracted attention precisely because the sail was so unusual. No other large theropod showed anything like it. And then the fossils were destroyed. This is one of the great tragedies of paleontological history. The original Spinosaurus specimens, the holotype material on which Stromer's entire description was based, were housed in the Bayerische Staatssammlung für Paläontologie und Geologie in Munich. On the night of April 24th, 1944, Allied bombing raids struck the city. The museum took a direct hit. The collections were devastated. Stromer's Spinosaurus material, unique fossils recovered from a formation that has since proven very difficult to work, was turned to rubble and ash. What remained was Stromer's description, some drawings, some photographs, and a collection of plaster casts that preserved the shape, but not the substance of the original material. For the better part of 60 years, Spinosaurus existed primarily as a ghost, referenced in textbooks and scientific papers, listed in size comparisons, but known only from secondary sources and the fragmentary memory of a destroyed collection. New material trickled in over the following decades. Isolated teeth, vertebrae, partial skull elements were recovered from Morocco and Tunisia and other parts of North Africa. But it was not until 2014 that everything paleontologists thought they understood about this animal was overturned completely, in a revision so dramatic that it generated news coverage in publications that rarely noticed dinosaur research at all. The paper was authored by Nizar Ibrahim and his colleagues, including Paul Sereno, Simone Maganuco, and others. and it presented a partial but substantially more complete skeleton of Spinosaurus recovered from the Kemkem beds of Morocco. The specimen had been found by a local fossil hunter, its parts scattered through a market, eventually traced and assembled through a combination of scientific detective work and sheer persistence. And what it showed was not what anyone expected. The legs of Spinosaurus were short, dramatically proportionally, surprisingly short for an animal of its overall size. The femur, the thigh bone, was small relative to the body, reducing the animal's height at the hip and giving it a crouching, almost sprawling posture compared to the upright stance typical of large theropods. The feet were large and flat, with broad, paddle-like proportions. The center of mass, when reconstructed, sat far forward on the body, toward the chest and neck, rather than balanced over the hips, as in Tyrannosaurus. The neural spines were confirmed as extraordinarily tall, the sail or hump extending high above the backbone. The forelimbs were relatively robust. The skull was long and narrow, with conical, interlocking teeth rather than the blade-like serrated teeth typical of land-hunting theropods. Every one of these features pointed toward the same conclusion, and it was a conclusion that fundamentally changed the question of what Spinosaurus was and how it lived. Ibrahim and his colleagues argued that Spinosaurus was primarily aquatic. Not merely a wader, not just an opportunistic fisher visiting river margins, the way a modern grizzly bear fishes a salmon run, but a genuine swimmer, an animal that spent large portions of its life in the water, propelling itself through the floodplains and river channels of the Kemkem, with movements more reminiscent of a crocodilian than a tyrannosaur. This conclusion was not universally accepted. Science rarely produces unanimity on questions as complex as the lifestyle reconstruction of an extinct animal known from incomplete material. Some researchers question the interpretation of the short legs, noting that the specimen used for reconstruction might have been a juvenile, whose proportions would differ from an adult. Others argued that the bone density data, which Ibrahim and his team cited as evidence for aquatic ballasting, was ambiguous. Still others pointed out that the forelimb proportions, while robust, were not as extreme as those of genuinely aquatic tetrapods. The debate continued in the literature for years after the 2014 paper, and it continues in some form today. But subsequent work, including a remarkably complete set of tail vertebrae described in 2020 by Ibrahim and his collaborators, provided what many researchers considered compelling additional evidence. The tail of Spinosaurus, they showed, was laterally flattened and fin-like, with elongated neural spines and hemipophyses that together formed a structure strikingly similar to the tails of swimming animals like crocodilians and some aquatic lizards. A flat, muscular tail of this design is an efficient propulsive organ in water. It is not something you need or something natural selection would produce in an exclusively terrestrial animal. The aquatic hypothesis, while still not accepted by all paleontologists, gained significant traction with this discovery. What this means for understanding Spinosaurus as a predator is profound. If the aquatic interpretation is broadly correct, then Spinosaurus was not competing for the same prey or occupying the same ecological niche as the other large theropods sharing its world. Carcharodontosaurus was a land hunter, a pursuit and ambush predator targeting sauropods and large ornithopods on the floodplain margins and forested uplands. Spinosaurus, by contrast, was hunting in the water. Those long, narrow, conical teeth were perfectly suited for gripping slippery fish rather than tearing through the thick hides and dense musculature of large dinosaurs. The dense bones that reduced buoyancy would have helped it stay submerged while hunting. The paddle-like feet may have aided in pushing through muddy riverbeds or in swimming. The position of the nostrils, set far back on the skull compared to other large theropods, would have allowed it to breathe with its snout partially submerged, in the manner of a crocodilian. Spinosaurus, on this reading, was the largest fish-eating animal that has ever lived. A predator of a river ecosystem so productive and so vast that it could support a creature approaching or perhaps exceeding 15 meters in length on a diet of enormous Cretaceous fish. The sail remains one of Spinosaurus's most visually striking features, and its function is still debated. The neural spines are so tall, in some cases reaching heights of up to 1.5 meters, that they constitute a major portion of the animal's overall silhouette. Modern interpretations range widely. Some researchers have proposed that the spines supported a sail of skin used for thermoregulation, absorbing heat in cool conditions and radiating it in warm ones, a strategy seen in the distantly related Permian synapsid Dimetrodon. Others have argued that the spines supported a hump of fat or muscle, more like the hump of a bison or a dromedary camel, serving as an energy reserve during periods of scarce food. Still others have suggested that the sail or hump was primarily for visual display, used in social signaling between individuals of the same species, a hypothesis consistent with the observation that many modern large animals develop elaborate visual structures whose primary function is communication, rather than mechanical advantage. Whatever its purpose, the sail made Spinosaurus one of the most visually distinctive animals that has ever walked or swum on this planet. Now travel forward in time. Move past the Cenomanian, past the Turonian, the Coniacian, the Santonian, the Campanian, through roughly 30 million years of Earth history to the very last stage of the Cretaceous period. Geologists call this the Maastrichtian. The date is somewhere between 66 and 68 million years ago, and the world you arrive in is different from the Chem in almost every measurable way. This is the world of Tyrannosaurus Rex, and it is, in its own way, just as strange and specific and perfectly calibrated to produce a particular kind of predator as the warm floodplains of northern Africa had been 3 decades of millions of years earlier. The continent you are standing on would eventually become North America, but it does not yet have that shape. A shallow inland sea, which paleontologists call the Western Interior Seaway, has been dividing the continent roughly down the middle for millions of years, creating 2 separate landmasses, a western strip called Laramidia and an eastern landmass called Appalachia, with a warm, sunlit body of water stretching between them. The sea is retreating now, in these final millions of years before the end Cretaceous extinction, slowly pulling back as geological forces lift the western portion of the continent. The landscape of Laramidia is in transition, a mosaic of coastal plains, river deltas, swampy lowlands, and the emerging shadows of mountain ranges rising to the west, as the tectonic processes that will eventually build the modern Rockies continue their slow work. The ecology of this late Cretaceous Laramidian landscape is extraordinary in its richness and specificity. This is a world that already has flowering plants in abundance. Magnolias, fig-like trees, early members of the rose and legume families, are growing alongside the ferns and cycads and conifers that are still present from earlier Mesozoic times. The result is a more visually varied landscape than the fern plains of the Jurassic or the early Cretaceous, patchwork in its structure, with dense riparian corridors of vegetation along waterways giving way to more open coastal plain habitats. The climate is warm, globally warmer than today, without permanent ice caps at the poles, but it is not the saturated equatorial heat of the Chem. This is a mid-latitude environment with genuine seasonal variation, temperature changes between summer and winter that would have been meaningful to the animals living through them. And the animals are remarkable. The herbivores of the Hell Creek Formation, that geological record of late Maastrichtian life in what is now Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, represent some of the most spectacular herbivorous dinosaurs ever to evolve. Triceratops, the massive ceratopsid with its 3-horned face and enormous bony frill, is one of the most common large animals in this ecosystem. So common that some localities have produced multiple Triceratops skulls within a small area. Edmontosaurus, a large hadrosaur or duck-billed dinosaur, moved in herds across the coastal plain, an animal that in some specimens has been preserved with its skin, showing us that it was covered in small, pebbly scales with no feathers. A solid, massive, surprisingly graceful animal when alive. And if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Ankylosaurus, armored head to tail in thick osteoderms and carrying a massive bone and tendon club at the end of its tail, moved through the undergrowth in smaller numbers. Pachycephalosaurus and its relatives were present, dome-headed, thickly skulled dinosaurs whose function and behavior remain subjects of genuine scientific debate. The Ceratopsian Torosaurus, long thought to be a separate genus from Triceratops, before a vigorous debate about whether the two forms represent different growth stages of the same animal, complicated the picture, added further variety to the herbivore guild. Into this landscape, at the apex, sits Tyrannosaurus Rex. And the first thing to understand about Tyrannosaurus Rex is that it is, in many ways, an outlier even within its own lineage, the Tyrannosaurids, which were themselves already a successful and diverse group of predatory theropods long before the Rex species appeared. Tyrannosaurids had been present in Laramidia for tens of millions of years before Tyrannosaurus Rex evolved. They included animals like Daspletosaurus, which preceded Rex in the same region, and Albertosaurus, which was slightly more gracile and somewhat earlier. These earlier Tyrannosaurids were already large, formidable predators, but they were not quite as extreme as what Tyrannosaurus Rex eventually became. The Rex species seems to represent, in the context of its lineage, a kind of evolutionary intensification, a pushing of the Tyrannosaurid body plan further in the direction of raw, crushing, overwhelming force than any of its predecessors had taken it. The skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, when you examine it carefully, is a record of specialization so extreme that it borders on the grotesque. The skull is enormous, proportionally much larger relative to body size than in most other theropods, and it is built not for speed or delicacy, but for force. The teeth of Tyrannosaurus are not the blade-like, laterally compressed, serrated cutting instruments found in most large theropods, including Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus. They are thick, robust, banana-shaped, with round cross-sections that resist bending forces. They are, in the words of paleontologist Greg Erickson, who has studied them extensively, more like railroad spikes than like steak knives. They were not designed primarily for slicing through flesh. They were designed for transmitting enormous forces into bone and breaking it. Bite force studies, which have used a variety of methodologies including scaling analyses, bone deformation models, and comparisons with living animals, have consistently found that Tyrannosaurus had the most powerful bite of any terrestrial animal for which we have reliable data, with estimates ranging from approximately 35,000 to 60,000 newtons depending on methodology and the specific part of the jaw modeled. For context, a large saltwater crocodile, which has one of the most powerful bites of any living animal, produces roughly 16,000 newtons. Tyrannosaurus was capable of roughly 2 to 4 times as much. The evidence that Tyrannosaurus routinely used this force on bone is not speculative. It is directly preserved in the fossil record. Bones of Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, and the other prey animals from Hell Creek localities show deep, parallel gouges that match the spacing and profile of Tyrannosaurus teeth. Some of these marks are so deep that the teeth penetrated completely through the bone into the medullary cavity. Bone fragments have been found in fossilized Tyrannosaurus coprolites, the preserved dung of the animal, confirming that it was ingesting and digesting bone material, presumably to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside. This bone-crushing behavior is now considered a central feature of Tyrannosaurus's ecological strategy, not an incidental behavior, but a core part of what made it such an effective apex predator in its environment. No other large theropod has left such unambiguous evidence of systematic bone crushing. The forelimbs of Tyrannosaurus are, of course, famous for being small, and their small size has provoked more humour and more genuine scientific puzzlement than almost any other feature of any prehistoric animal. An adult Tyrannosaurus Rex, an animal that might weigh 8 or 9 tons and measure 12 to 13 meters in length, had arms approximately 1 meter long, terminating in 2-fingered hands that could not reach the animal's own mouth. This disproportion is real and it is striking, but the arms were not vestigial. The muscles attached to them, reconstructed from the bone scars left by their attachment points, were substantial. The arms of Tyrannosaurus were extraordinarily powerful for their size, capable of exerting hundreds of kilograms of force, even if they could not extend very far or reach very far from the body. Various hypotheses have been proposed for their function, from pinning struggling prey to the ground during feeding, to assisting the animal in rising from a resting position. None of these hypotheses has been definitively proven. What is clear is that the arms were reduced relative to ancestral Tyrannosaurids, that the reduction was a derived feature of the Rex lineage, and that whatever function remained was sufficient for natural selection to maintain rather than eliminate the arms entirely. The legs of Tyrannosaurus tell a different story from the arms, and it is a story of constraint and trade-off. This was an enormous animal, and enormous animals face biomechanical challenges that smaller ones do not. The bones of the legs must support the animal's entire weight, plus the forces generated during locomotion, plus the forces generated during prey capture. As body mass increases, the stresses on leg bones scale faster than the cross-sectional area of those bones, which means that very large animals must either have proportionally thicker legs relative to body size, move more slowly, or some combination of both. Tyrannosaurus appears to have done the latter. Locomotion studies, particularly those using computer models of the musculoskeletal system, developed by teams including John Hutchinson at the Royal Veterinary College in London, have suggested that Tyrannosaurus was not a fast runner in the conventional sense. The most defensible estimates for its top speed cluster around 17 to 25 kilometers per hour, with the lower end of that range considered more likely for the largest individuals. A modern human in reasonable physical condition can sprint at around 28 to 30 kilometers per hour. This does not mean that Tyrannosaurus was slow in any ecologically meaningful sense, because the animals it was hunting were also large and faced the same biomechanical constraints. Triceratops was not a gazelle. Edmontosaurus, while capable of reasonable speed when panicked, was a multi-ton animal moving on 4 limbs, not built for sustained flight from predators. The speed of Tyrannosaurus needs to be evaluated against the speed of its prey, and in that context, it was more than adequate. What Tyrannosaurus also possessed, and what has become more appreciated in recent decades as new fossils and new analytical techniques have refined our understanding, is a sensory apparatus of extraordinary sophistication for a dinosaur. The brain case of Tyrannosaurus, examined through CT scanning, reveals olfactory bulbs that were proportionally very large, suggesting a sense of smell at least as acute as that of a modern turkey vulture, which is among the most sensitive noses in the avian world. The visual system appears to have been frontal-facing, with eyes positioned to provide substantial binocular overlap, which means depth perception, the ability to judge distances accurately, a feature associated with active predators in modern ecosystems. The inner ear morphology suggests good low-frequency hearing. All of this paints a picture of a sensory predator, an animal that was finding and tracking prey through multiple channels of information simultaneously, not simply charging at whatever moved. The question of whether Tyrannosaurus was primarily a predator or primarily a scavenger was the subject of a vigorous and sometimes heated scientific debate during the 1990s and 2000s, largely driven by the paleontologist Jack Horner, who argued that the sensory and locomotor profile of Tyrannosaurus was more consistent with a dedicated scavenger than with an active pursuit predator. But the balance of evidence as it has accumulated, point strongly toward Tyrannosaurus as an active predator that also scavenged opportunistically, which is the feeding strategy of virtually every large terrestrial predator alive today. The healed bite marks found on the bones of prey animals, showing that the bitten animal survived the attack and lived long enough for the bone to begin remodeling, are the most compelling evidence. A scavenger bites dead animals. Dead animals do not heal. The fact that some Edmontosaurus and other prey bones show Tyrannosaurus-compatible bite marks that subsequently healed demonstrates unambiguously that Tyrannosaurus bit living animals that survived to live another day. At least sometimes, it was hunting. Actively. Whatever else it was doing between kills, it was also hunting. To understand a predator fully, you have to understand its prey. This is not simply a matter of diet, of what the predator ate and how it caught and killed its food. It is a matter of the deeper evolutionary relationship between predator and prey. The way each shapes the other through the mechanism of natural selection, acting simultaneously and in opposite directions on both sides of the predator-prey interaction. A predator that is more effective creates selection pressure on its prey to become harder to catch. Prey that is harder to catch creates selection pressure on the predator to become more effective at catching it. This back and forth, sometimes called the evolutionary arms race, is one of the primary drivers of complexity and specialization in biological communities, and it was operating in both the Hell Creek ecosystem and the Chem-Chem ecosystem, with the same relentless logic that it operates in every living ecosystem today. Consider what it meant to be a Triceratops in the late Cretaceous of Laramidia. Triceratops was not a passive victim. It was a large, heavily built ceratopsid, its body covered in thick skin over a robust skeletal frame, its most forward-facing features dominated by the enormous frill of bone extending behind the skull and the 3 horns projecting from the face. The nasal horn was substantial, typically somewhat smaller than the 2 brow horns, but all 3 were real weapons, sharply pointed, anchored in solid bone, and capable of inflicting serious wounds on an animal that chose to attack from the front. The frill, while not solid bone across its full extent, and therefore probably not primarily a defensive shield, was massive and visually imposing, and may have served partly as a visual signal, particularly in interactions between Triceratops individuals. An adult Triceratops, weighing 6 to 8 metric tons, with its head lowered and its horns pointed forward, was a genuinely formidable adversary for any predator, even a Tyrannosaurus. The bone pathologies on Tyrannosaurus specimens that suggest healed bite wounds from intraspecific encounters are not the only evidence of a dangerous life for these animals. Several Tyrannosaurus specimens show other healed injuries consistent with damage sustained during prey encounters, including rib fractures that had subsequently healed, and other bone deformations suggestive of trauma. An animal that regularly attempted to subdue large, well-armed prey was going to get hurt sometimes, and the fossil evidence suggests that Tyrannosaurus individuals did indeed sustain significant injuries that they survived. The specimen known as Sue, the most complete individual, showed evidence of bone infections, healed fractures, and other pathologies that painted a picture of a long, physically demanding life, as all large predators live, punctuated by injuries sustained in the course of obtaining food. The hadrosaurs, animals like Edmontosaurus, present a different kind of prey profile. They were not armed in the obvious way that Triceratops was. They had no horns, no massive frill, no heavily armored skin. Their primary defense was probably behavioral. The advantages of group living and vigilance, of many eyes and ears watching for danger from multiple directions simultaneously, of the herd response that in modern ungulates can sometimes deter or confuse a predator. Fossil evidence from several sites in North America suggests that hadrosaurs did indeed aggregate in large numbers, probably moving in herds across the coastal plain in search of vegetation and water. A Tyrannosaurus hunting a hadrosaur herd would have faced the challenge of selecting a target from among potentially dozens or hundreds of animals, many of them watching it, ready to flee, with the herd dynamics making a straightforward approach difficult. The predator would need patience and strategic thinking, or at least the behavioral equivalent of it, the ability to probe the herd, identify a vulnerable individual, and select the moment and direction of attack carefully. This is exactly what modern large predators do when hunting gregarious prey, and the parallel is almost certainly not coincidental. In the Chem-Chem, the fish that Spinosaurus was hunting were themselves extraordinary animals by modern standards. Onchopristis numida, the enormous sawfish whose rostral teeth appear frequently in the fossil record of North African Cretaceous deposits, grew to lengths of roughly 7 to 8 meters, and was armored with a distinctive rostrum lined with curved, barbed denticles that could inflict serious wounds on anything that seized or was struck by it. Catching an Onchopristis would not have been a passive or risk-free experience for a Spinosaurus. The enormous fish, thrashing in the grip of a predator, could have used its rostrum actively as a defensive weapon, potentially causing significant damage to the predator's snout and face. The conical, interlocking teeth of Spinosaurus and the robust construction of its skull may in part reflect the demands of dealing with prey that could fight back effectively. Similarly, the large catfish and lungfish of the Chem-Chem waterways, while less dramatically armored than Onchopristis, were large and muscular animals whose capture required effective restraint, and the grip-oriented dentition of Spinosaurids was clearly well-suited to holding struggling fish rather than simply puncturing or slicing through them. There is something deeply satisfying about recognizing that the extraordinary anatomy of these apex predators was not produced in a vacuum of unopposed evolutionary optimization, but was instead the outcome of a negotiation conducted in the currency of survival and reproduction, between predator and prey, each pushing the other toward greater effectiveness through the blind mechanism of natural selection. The bone-crushing bite of Tyrannosaurus did not appear all at once, fully formed as the ideal solution to the problem of subduing large, well-armed prey. It evolved gradually over millions of years, with each increment in bite force and tooth robustness, conferring a slight advantage in exploiting prey that other predators could not as effectively process, and with each improvement in the prey's defensive capabilities, creating pressure for the next increment in predatory effectiveness. The arms race was slow, measured in geological time, operating generation by generation, through the differential survival of individuals whose particular combination of inherited traits made them slightly more or slightly less effective at the tasks their lives required. The world of these animals was, for all its drama and all its violence, also a world of extraordinary ecological balance, maintained not by any intention or purpose, but by the mechanical operation of natural selection, acting on variation and producing, over immense spans of time, communities of organisms exquisitely calibrated to each other's presence. When that calibration was disrupted, whether by the gradual ecological changes that ended the Chem-Chem world, or by the catastrophic impact that ended the Hell Creek world, the community collapsed with a totality that no amount of individual adaptation could prevent. Because adaptation operates at the scale of individuals and populations across generations, and catastrophic disruption operates at the scale of entire ecosystems in years or decades. The arms race pauses when the battlefield itself disappears, and for both Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus, the battlefield eventually disappeared, leaving behind only the bones, the deep impressions in ancient stone, and the long, slow work of scientific curiosity trying to reconstruct what once stood in the light of a Cretaceous afternoon, hunting and being hunted, in a world that has not existed for longer than the human mind can genuinely hold. To understand what Spinosaurus was in its evolutionary context, it helps to pull back from the single species and look at the lineage it belonged to, the Spinosaurids, a family of large theropod dinosaurs that ranged across what would become Europe, Africa, South America, and Asia during the Cretaceous period. Spinosaurids are united by a suite of shared skeletal features. The elongated, narrow skulls, the conical and often slightly curved teeth, the tendency toward relatively robust forelimbs, and in several lineages, the elongated neural spines of the dorsal vertebrae. Though not all Spinosaurids express the extreme sail development seen in Spinosaurus itself, they appear to have shared a broadly similar ecological strategy, emphasizing fish and other aquatic prey as a primary food source, though most of them were clearly capable of taking other prey when the opportunity arose. The best-known spinosaurid outside of Spinosaurus itself is Baryonyx walkeri, discovered in 1983 in Surrey, England, by amateur fossil hunter William Walker, whose name it partly commemorates. The discovery of Baryonyx was itself a significant event in paleontological history, partly because the specimen was remarkably complete by the standards of English dinosaur material, and partly because of what was found inside the ribcage and associated with the skeleton. Scales and bones from large fish were present near the stomach region, along with partial remains of a young iguanodon. This is direct physical evidence of diet, the kind of evidence that is vanishingly rare in the fossil record. It confirmed that Baryonyx was indeed doing what its tooth morphology and skull shape suggested it should be doing, catching fish, but also demonstrated that it was not exclusively piscivorous, the technical term for fish eating, and that it was capable of taking terrestrial prey as well. Baryonyx was significantly smaller than Spinosaurus, estimated at about 9 to 10 meters in length, and it did not develop the extreme neural spine elongation of its larger African relative. But in its skull morphology and general body plan, it was recognizably a member of the same family. Suchomimus tenerensis, described by Paul Serino and colleagues in 1998 from the Elras Formation of the Republic of Niger, was a larger and more imposing spinosaurid, estimated at 11 to 12 meters in length. Its name means crocodile mimic from Tenere, a reference to the Tenere desert region where it was found, and the name is apt. The skull of Suchomimus was long and low and lined with teeth that interlocked when the jaws closed, in a pattern clearly adapted to gripping and retaining slippery prey. The neural spines of Suchomimus were elongated more so than in Baryonyx, suggesting that the tendency towards sail or hump development was already present in the lineage and was being amplified progressively toward the extreme expression seen in Spinosaurus. The massive thumb claw of Suchomimus, like the formidable hand claw of Baryonyx, was also present, a large recurved hook of keratin on bone that would have been an effective tool for hooking fish from the water or raking through soft sediment. These spinosaurids as a group appear to have been extraordinarily successful at exploiting the freshwater and estuarine ecosystems of the Mesozoic world, diversifying across multiple continents and persisting for tens of millions of years during the Cretaceous. Their decline at the end of the Cretaceous was part of the broader extinction that ended the non-avian dinosaurs. The Tyrannosaurid lineage, by contrast, has a history that is in some ways less visually dramatic in its earlier stages, but ultimately more influential in shaping the ecology of the latest Cretaceous. Early Tyrannosauroids, the broader group that includes the Tyrannosaurids and their close relatives, were not the enormous apex predators they later became. Proceratosaurus, from the middle Jurassic of England, was a small, crested theropod that many researchers now consider a very early member of the Tyrannosauroid lineage, though its affinities are not without debate. By the early Cretaceous, Tyrannosauroids had diversified into a variety of forms in Asia and North America, including some that were surprisingly small and gracile. Guanlong Wukai, from the late Jurassic of China, was an early Tyrannosauroid with a dramatic, elaborate cranial crest, an ornamental structure that suggests that social display through visual signals was part of the Tyrannosauroid behavioral repertoire from very early in their evolutionary history. The key transition in Tyrannosauroid evolution came during the Cretaceous, when several lineages began increasing dramatically in body size. Yutyrannus huali, described from China in 2012, was a very large tyrannosauroid from the early Cretaceous, estimated at roughly 9 meters in length. And it preserved something extraordinary: direct evidence of feathers. Fossil filaments associated with multiple specimens of Yutyrannus indicate that at least this large early tyrannosauroid was covered in a coat of simple, filamentous feathers. Not the complex penniceous feathers of modern birds, but something more like the downy coverings seen in modern ratites or young birds of many species. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This discovery had implications for how we think about the larger tyrannosaurids that came later, including Tyrannosaurus Rex itself. If a large early tyrannosauroid had feathers, did later larger members of the lineage retain them, reduce them, or lose them entirely? The evidence on this question is genuinely ambiguous. Several specimens of large tyrannosaurids, including material from Tyrannosaurus itself, have preserved patches of skin impression, not the full skin of a mummified specimen, but isolated patches of epidermis pressed into surrounding sediment before decay could remove them. These impressions show small, pebbly scales, not feathers, but skin impressions are preserved only from specific body regions, primarily the belly, sides, and some portions of the tail and legs. We do not have skin impressions from the back, the neck, or the top of the head for Tyrannosaurus. It is possible, perhaps even probable, that Tyrannosaurus had a mix of scaly and feathered regions, as modern birds do, with feathers concentrated in regions where they were most functionally useful. It is also possible that the extreme body size of Tyrannosaurus created thermoregulatory pressures that favored reducing feather coverage, just as modern large mammals like elephants and hippos have very sparse hair compared to smaller relatives. We do not know for certain. What we do know is that the image of a completely scale-covered, reptilian Tyrannosaurus that dominated popular culture for most of the 20th century was probably not entirely accurate, and that the truth was likely something more complex and more visually interesting. One aspect of Tyrannosaurus that has emerged with striking clarity from recent research is the evidence for its growth and life history. Growth rings preserved in the cross-sections of long bones, analogous in principle to the growth rings of a tree, have allowed paleontologists to reconstruct the growth rates and lifespans of individual Tyrannosaurus specimens. The results were surprising to many researchers. Tyrannosaurus Rex grew extremely rapidly during adolescence, adding hundreds of kilograms per year during peak growth phases, and reached something close to adult size relatively quickly. The specimen known as Sue, housed at the Field Museum in Chicago, and the most complete Tyrannosaurus skeleton ever found, was determined from its bone rings to have been approximately 28 years old at the time of its death. This is not an enormous lifespan by the standards of large modern animals. Elephants routinely live 60 or 70 years. But the bone ring evidence suggests that most Tyrannosaurus individuals did not survive long past their late 20s, even under favorable conditions, making each individual's life, from the perspective of natural selection, a relatively brief but very intense period of growth and reproduction. The social life of Tyrannosaurus remains almost entirely unknown, and this is one of the more frustrating gaps in our understanding of the animal. There is no direct evidence of social grouping from the Hell Creek Formation. No bone beds comparable to the mass accumulations seen in some ceratopsid and hadrosaur species that imply herding behavior. But there is also no strong evidence against the possibility of some form of social interaction. The bone ring evidence suggests that Tyrannosaurus adolescents were living and dying in numbers, and like many modern large predators, they may have had complex social hierarchies or at least territorial systems that organize their interactions. We simply do not know. The fossil record, even for one of the most intensively studied dinosaurs in history, leaves vast territories of behavior and ecology completely inaccessible. What the fossil record does preserve with unusual completeness for a dinosaur is the spectrum of individual variation within the Tyrannosaurus Rex species. Enough specimens have now been recovered and measured, more than 50 reasonably complete individuals from North American late Cretaceous sites, to allow statistical analysis of body proportions within the species. This analysis has revealed something that has become one of the more entertaining ongoing debates in Tyrannosaurus research. There appear to be two distinct morphological types within the species, one more robust and one more gracile, with differences in the thickness of the femur and in the shape of certain skull bones. Some researchers, notably Thomas Carr and Gregory Paul, have argued that these morphological differences likely reflect sexual dimorphism. The physical differences between male and female individuals, with the more robust form possibly representing females, who in many large modern animals are larger or more heavily built than males. Others have argued that the differences represent normal individual variation, or that the sample is simply too small to make definitive statistical claims about sexual dimorphism. The debate is ongoing, and it serves as a reminder that even an animal as famous and as well-studied as Tyrannosaurus Rex retains genuine scientific mysteries that a few dozen more good specimens might go a long way toward resolving. The question of size sits at the heart of almost every popular comparison between Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus, and it deserves careful treatment, because the popular version of the size story is considerably simpler than what the fossil evidence actually supports. For most of the late 20th century, Tyrannosaurus was considered the largest known terrestrial predator that ever lived. This distinction was a source of enormous cultural weight. It was part of what made Tyrannosaurus Rex the apex of the popular dinosaur hierarchy, the animal that other animals were compared to, the benchmark. And then, as new Spinosaurus material was described and reassessed, the picture became more complicated. The honest accounting of size in both animals requires first acknowledging how difficult it is to measure the body size of an extinct animal from fragmentary remains. We are not, in most cases, working from complete skeletons. We are working from portions of skeletons, often isolated elements, that must be scaled against reference points from better-known specimens or from the comparative anatomy of living animals. Different researchers use different scaling methods, different reference specimens, and different assumptions about soft tissue contributions to overall body mass. And these methodological differences can produce estimates that vary by hundreds of kilograms, or even by a meter or more in length. When you read that Tyrannosaurus Rex was 12 meters long, or that Spinosaurus was 15 meters long, you are reading estimates, best current approximations based on available material and current methodology, not measurements taken from a complete skeleton laid out on a laboratory floor. With that caveat clearly stated, here is what the evidence broadly suggests. The largest known Tyrannosaurus Rex specimens, including Sioux and a specimen known as Scotty, discovered in Saskatchewan, Canada, and described in detail in 2019 by Scott Persons and colleagues, are estimated at approximately 12 to 12.5 meters in length and roughly 8 to 9 metric tons in mass. Scotty, based on the bone ring analysis, was a relatively old individual by Tyrannosaurus standards, approximately 28 to 30 years old, and it showed the kind of bone pathologies, healed injuries, and evidence of disease that accumulate over a long, demanding life as an apex predator. Its sheer physical size, combined with evidence of the wear and damage it had accumulated, makes it one of the most compelling individual animals in the fossil record. A real creature whose life left marks on its bones. But 12 to 12.5 meters and 8 to 9 tons is the upper end of the known size range for Rex. Most individuals for which we have reliable size estimates were somewhat smaller. For Spinosaurus, the picture is more complicated because the material is more fragmentary, and because the 2014 redescription introduced body proportions that had not previously been part of the scientific consensus. Based on the Moroccan material and the earlier Egyptian material described by Stroma, current estimates for the largest Spinosaurus individuals range from approximately 14 to 15 meters in length, though some estimates have gone higher. In terms of length, Spinosaurus almost certainly exceeded Tyrannosaurus Rex. The question of mass is more nuanced. The shorter legs and different body proportions of Spinosaurus, as reconstructed from the Ibrahim and colleagues' specimens, suggest a somewhat different mass distribution than in Tyrannosaurus. Estimates for Spinosaurus body mass range quite widely, from roughly 7 to 20 metric tons, depending on the reconstruction used and the assumptions about soft tissue volume. The broad scientific consensus at present accepts that Spinosaurus was longer than Tyrannosaurus Rex, but that a direct mass comparison is very uncertain given the incomplete material and the unusual body proportions. What this means in practice is that the popular narrative, which tends to cast Spinosaurus simply as the bigger animal and therefore the more impressive predator, is simultaneously somewhat true and significantly misleading. Spinosaurus was probably longer, yes. Whether it was heavier is genuinely unclear. But more importantly, body size alone tells you very little about ecological dominance or predatory effectiveness. A giant squid is enormously larger than a great white shark. This does not make it a more formidable predator in any ecological sense, because it is adapted to a completely different environment and prey base. Size needs to be evaluated in the context of what the animal was eating, how it was catching its food, what competitors and prey it shared its ecosystem with, and what the specific demands of its environment required of its body. By every indication we have, Spinosaurus was not competing against large terrestrial dinosaurian prey in the way that Tyrannosaurus Rex was. Its skull and teeth were not designed for it. The long, narrow jaws that interlocked around fish would have been mechanically poor at the kind of bone-crushing, tissue-tearing biting that dealing with a multi-ton hadrosaur or ceratopsid requires. The teeth would have been damaged. The skull might have been structurally compromised by the kinds of forces involved in killing and dismembering enormous terrestrial dinosaurs. Spinosaurus, on the aquatic interpretation, was something more like an enormous heron or pelican than like a lion. It was supremely adapted for the business of catching enormous fish in a productive floodplain ecosystem. It was, within that ecological context, almost certainly without peer. No other animal in the Kem or in the contemporary North African Cretaceous ecosystem was competing with it for the same large fish, in the same waterways, in the same way. It occupied a niche that was apparently so productive and so large that it supported an animal of extraordinary body size. Tyrannosaurus Rex, by contrast, was competing directly for the dominant ecological role in a terrestrial predator guild on a productive coastal plain, and it was doing so in a way that appears to have been extraordinarily effective. The Hell Creek Formation produces Triceratops and Edmontosaurus bones with Tyrannosaurus bite marks on them. It produces Tyrannosaurus coprolites full of bone fragments. It produces the remains of one of the most formidable terrestrial predators the world has ever seen, in numbers that suggest it was genuinely the dominant large predator of its environment. Tyrannosaurus was not the most impressive predator that has ever lived by virtue of raw size alone. It was the most impressive by virtue of what it was built to do, and how effectively it did it in the specific, defined, demanding context of its ecosystem. The famous film released in 2001 by the BBC and Discovery Channel, Walking with Prehistoric Beasts, depicted a confrontation between a Spinosaurus and a Tyrannosaurus in which the Spinosaurus killed the Tyrannosaurus. This was fiction on multiple levels, not just because the animals never shared the same time or place, but because the filmmakers made choices about the encounter that were not grounded in what we know about either animal's biology. The scene generated an enormous amount of discussion and not a little outrage among paleontologists, some of whom felt that it misrepresented what the fossil evidence supported. But it also crystallized the popular question in a way that has proven extremely persistent. People have been arguing about it ever since, and the arguments continue in comment sections and internet forums and schoolyards with a tenacity that suggests the question has touched something deep in how we relate to these animals. The persistence of the question might be worth examining for a moment. Why do we want so badly to rank these two animals? Why does the question of which one would win feel so urgent, even when we know that the hypothetical is impossible? Part of it is surely the narrative instinct, the deep human preference for stories that have a winner and a loser, a resolution, a hierarchy. We are uncomfortable with the idea that two things can both be extraordinary without one being definitively superior to the other. We want a tournament bracket because tournament brackets have outcomes, but part of it is also the particular emotional relationship that many people have with these specific animals, formed in childhood when the idea of the world's most powerful predator seemed like the most important question imaginable, and carrying through into adulthood with all the nostalgic weight of early wonder. These animals are not just animals in the popular imagination, they are symbols. They carry the weight of a particular kind of awe, the awe of enormous, ancient, incomprehensible power, and the desire to rank them is, in part, a desire to locate that power within a familiar, comprehensible framework. But the scientific reality is richer and more interesting than any ranking. What the comparison between Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus actually reveals, when you follow it carefully and honestly, is something about how evolution explores the possible space of large predatory forms, how different environments select for radically different solutions to the problem of being very large and needing to eat, and how the same Mesozoic world could simultaneously contain, in different corners, animals that look superficially similar, large, bipedal, carnivorous, but are in their deep biology almost polar opposites of each other. That is the more honest and the more astonishing story. Not which one would win, but what they tell us about the range of what life can become when given enough time and the right conditions. The word ruled is the most interesting word in the question people keep asking. T-Rex versus Spinosaurus. Who actually ruled the prehistoric world? It sounds straightforward. It implies dominance, superiority, a kind of sovereign power over the landscape and its inhabitants. But ruling an ecosystem, in any meaningful ecological sense, is not a property of an individual animal or even of a species. It is a relationship between a species and its environment, its prey, its competitors, and the millions of interacting variables that shape a community of organisms over time. No animal rules in a vacuum. Every apex predator is made by its world as much as it makes its world. Consider what ecological dominance actually looks like in living systems. The lion is often described as the king of the African savanna, but the reality is considerably more complex. Lions share their ecosystem with spotted hyenas, which are roughly equal to them in many dimensions of predatory effectiveness, and which significantly outcompete lions on carcasses when they arrive in large numbers. Lions share their ecosystem with leopards, cheetahs, African wild dogs, and a variety of other predators that occupy overlapping but distinct niches. The actual structure of the predator guild in a modern African ecosystem is not a simple hierarchy with a king at the top. It is a web of competitive and cooperative interactions, of habitat partitioning and prey specialization and seasonal shift, that produces a dynamic, constantly negotiated coexistence among multiple predatory species. Something similar was almost certainly true in both the Kem-Kem ecosystem and the Hell Creek ecosystem, and it is worth looking at those predator guilds in more detail to understand what Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus were actually doing within them. In the Hell Creek formation, Tyrannosaurus Rex is the only known large theropod dinosaur. This is a remarkable and somewhat unusual situation. Most other dinosaur-bearing formations contain multiple species of large theropod predator occupying different ecological roles. The Morrison Formation, several tens of millions of years earlier, had Allosaurus, Torvosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and several other large predators coexisting in what must have been a partitioned predator guild with some degree of prey and habitat specialization among them. But in the latest Cretaceous of Laramidia, Tyrannosaurus appears to have been the sole large theropod predator, at least in the Hell Creek ecosystem specifically. It did not share the apex predator role with another large theropod in the way that Spinosaurus shared its ecosystem with Carcharodontosaurus. Tyrannosaurus occupied the top of the terrestrial food web in an apparently exclusive way, which has led some researchers to suggest that the evolution of tyrannosaurids to very large size may itself have competitively excluded other large theropod lineages from the apex predator role, essentially filling the large predator niche so completely that no other lineage could maintain a foothold at comparable size. The Chem-Chem ecosystem, by contrast, was strikingly different in its structure. Multiple large predators occupied this environment simultaneously, and the coexistence of Spinosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, and possibly other large theropods in the same region has been a source of genuine puzzlement to paleontologists. How does an ecosystem support so many large predators? Several hypotheses have been proposed. One emphasizes the extraordinary productivity of the floodplain environment, with its enormous fish populations and abundant sauropod herbivores, suggesting that the prey base was simply large enough to support multiple apex predators. Another emphasizes ecological partitioning, the idea that these predators were not actually competing directly with each other, because they were targeting different prey species in different microhabitats, with Spinosaurus concentrated in aquatic environments, and Carcharodontosaurus concentrated in more terrestrial settings. This partitioning hypothesis is consistent with the anatomical and ecological reconstructions of both animals. A Spinosaurus hunting enormous fish in a deep river channel and a Carcharodontosaurus ambushing sauropods on the floodplain margin are not competing for the same food, even if they occasionally cross paths. The concept of ecological partitioning is one of the most important ideas in community ecology, and it appears, when you look carefully at the evidence, to describe exactly what was happening in the Chem-Chem. Large ecosystems can support multiple apex predators because the predators divide the available resources along multiple axes simultaneously, not just prey species, but also habitat, hunting time, prey size, and hunting method. Modern African ecosystems show this clearly. Lions hunt by coordinated ambush in open grassland, targeting medium to large ungulates. Leopards hunt solitarily, often in woodland, targeting smaller prey and caching kills in trees. Cheetahs hunt by high-speed pursuit in open ground. Crocodiles hunt in or near water. Each specialization reduces direct competition with the others, allowing multiple predator species to coexist at the same geographic location. Something broadly similar was operating in the Chem-Chem, with Spinosaurus occupying the aquatic predator niche and Carcharodontosaurus the terrestrial large prey niche, reducing the overlap between them and allowing both to maintain viable populations. This insight changes the question of what it means to rule an ecosystem in the context of either animal. Spinosaurus, in its own domain, in the warm floodplains and river channels of Cretaceous North Africa, was almost certainly the dominant predator of the aquatic environment. Nothing else in the Chem-Chem was competing with it for the same large fish in the same waterways with the same efficiency. In that specific sense, within that specific ecological domain, it was without peer, but it was not the dominant predator of the entire Chem-Chem ecosystem, in the sense of controlling or shaping the lives of every other large animal in the community. Carcharodontosaurus was doing that for the terrestrial fauna. The two animals occupied different thrones in different courts. To use a metaphor that is perhaps too anthropomorphic, but captures something of the spatial and ecological structure. Tyrannosaurus Rex, in its domain in the late Cretaceous of Laramidia, occupied a position that was in some respects even more complete. With no other large theropod competitor in its specific ecosystem, Tyrannosaurus was the sole apex predator across both the terrestrial and the semi-aquatic portions of its range. It was not partitioning the apex predator role with another large carnivore. It held that role exclusively, shaping the behavior and ecology of every large herbivore in its environment through the sheer fact of its existence. When Triceratops evolved the elaborate frill and horns that make it so visually spectacular, those structures were almost certainly shaped, at least in part, by selection pressure from Tyrannosaurus, the specific threat that made elaborate facial weaponry worth the metabolic cost of growing and maintaining it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. When Edmontosaurus evolved its duck-billed jaw and complex dental battery, the evolutionary context included a world in which a 12-ton predator with the most powerful bite in terrestrial vertebrate history was part of the selective landscape. The prey community of the Hell Creek Formation was shaped by Tyrannosaurus in ways that the prey community of the Kem was shaped by the combination of Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus together. There is also the matter of the wider predator community in each ecosystem, because large theropods did not hunt alone or without context. The Hell Creek Formation also contained dromaeosaurid raptors and troodontid dinosaurs, smaller and more agile predatory theropods that occupied the small to medium prey niches that Tyrannosaurus could not efficiently fill. The presence of these smaller predators suggests a layered predator guild, with Tyrannosaurus handling the large prey that only it could take down, and smaller theropods handling the diverse smaller prey that would have been energetically inefficient for Tyrannosaurus to pursue. A similar structure almost certainly existed in the Kem, where smaller theropods and the enormous variety of crocodilians must have occupied the smaller prey niches, while the megapredators focused on prey commensurate with their size. The crocodilians of the Kem deserve a moment of attention here, because they were themselves extraordinary animals that are rarely discussed in the shadow of the larger theropods. The Cretaceous freshwater and estuarine ecosystems of North Africa supported an astonishing diversity of crocodilians, ranging from small forms that may have been primarily terrestrial to enormous fish-eating specialists that rivaled small theropods in length. Sarcosuchus imperator, sometimes called supercroc in popular accounts, lived somewhat earlier than the Kem fauna, but in broadly similar environments, and reached lengths of approximately 9 to 10 meters, with a skull nearly 2 meters long. In the Kem itself, multiple crocodilian species coexisted, and several of them were large and formidable aquatic predators. Spinosaurus, moving through these waterways, would have shared the aquatic environment with crocodilians that were themselves significant predators, raising interesting questions about the interaction between the enormous theropod and these other large-jawed inhabitants of the same rivers, whether they competed directly, whether Spinosaurus occasionally preyed on smaller crocodilians, or whether they simply avoided each other is unknowable from the preserved material. But the Kem waterways were not a benign environment even for a 15-meter theropod. They were a complex, predator-dense, ecologically layered world in which Spinosaurus was the largest, but not the only formidable predator. The concept of convergent evolution is worth introducing at this point, because it illuminates something important about both Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus that the popular debate between them tends to obscure. Convergent evolution is the process by which unrelated or distantly related lineages independently evolve similar structures or strategies in response to similar ecological pressures. The most famous examples are the streamlined body forms of sharks, ichthyosaurs, and dolphins, Three groups with very different evolutionary origins that all converged on a similar hydrodynamic shape because the physics of moving efficiently through water imposes the same constraints on any sufficiently large swimmer, regardless of ancestry. The elongated, fish-catching skull morphology of Spinosaurids is itself a beautiful example of convergence with crocodilians. Both groups face the same challenge of catching slippery, fast-moving aquatic prey, and both evolved the same basic solution independently: the long, narrow snout with interlocking, conical teeth, because that shape solves the problem better than the alternatives. The bone-crushing, powerful bite strategy of Tyrannosaurus has its own convergent parallels. The spotted hyena, a member of the family Hyenidae rather than the canids or felids, independently evolved a bone-crushing capacity using massive premolar teeth and an extraordinarily robust skull, allowing it to access the marrow content of bones that other predators cannot process. The thylacine, the extinct marsupial wolf of Tasmania, convergently evolved many of the skull and body proportions of placental wolves, including the large canine teeth for gripping prey. In both cases, similar ecological roles, apex predation of large terrestrial vertebrates, produce similar anatomical solutions through the independent action of natural selection. Tyrannosaurus sits within this tradition of convergence, but takes it to an extreme that no other lineage has matched. The combination of bone-crushing dentition, enormous skull, powerful olfaction, binocular vision, and overall body mass in service of apex terrestrial predation is a solution to the large predator problem that evolution has not produced at this scale anywhere else in the record. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge the other giants, the animals that shared their worlds with Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus, but that rarely command the same popular attention, because their presence is essential to understanding what the apex predators of the Cretaceous were actually doing and how they fit into the larger ecology of their time. No large predator exists in isolation. Every apex predator is defined partly by what it is not, by the other predators it coexists with and differentiates itself from. And the predator guilds of the Cretaceous were more complex than the popular focus on two famous names tends to suggest. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, whose name means shark-toothed lizard from the Sahara, was in some respects the more straightforwardly terrifying predator of the chem-chem ecosystem, if terror is measured in terrestrial predatory effectiveness. First described in fragmentary form by Stromer in 1931, and later redescribed in substantially more complete form by Serino and colleagues in 1996, based on material from Morocco, Carcharodontosaurus was a massive theropod belonging to the Carcharodontosaurid family, a lineage that was widespread across the southern hemisphere during the Cretaceous, and that included some of the largest terrestrial predators ever to evolve. The teeth of Carcharodontosaurus, which give the animal its name, were large, laterally compressed, and serrated along both edges, the classic slicing and cutting instruments of a large flesh-eating theropod, targeting large terrestrial prey. They were the tools of an animal designed to bite into and tear through the hides and muscles of enormous sauropods, to inflict massive wounds and pursue prey that was weakened and bleeding, to feed on the enormous quantities of meat that a single large sauropod kill would provide. Carcharodontosaurus was estimated at roughly 12 to 13 meters in length, directly comparable to Tyrannosaurus, and its skull, while differing considerably in construction, was of broadly similar size and housed a similarly impressive battery of feeding tools adapted for large prey. The coexistence of Carcharodontosaurus and Spinosaurus in the chem-chem raises a question that goes beyond simple size comparison. How did two animals of roughly similar body length, both apex predators, partition their ecological roles sufficiently to allow both to maintain viable populations in the same region? The answer, as we have discussed, almost certainly lies in the aquatic versus terrestrial partitioning of the ecosystem. But it also raises a question about the occasions when these partitions must have blurred. A Spinosaurus emerging from the river onto the floodplain to bask or move between waterways would have been visible to any Carcharodontosaurus in the area. A Carcharodontosaurus approaching the riverbank to drink would have been within potential striking distance of a Spinosaurus. Whether these encounters ever became confrontational, whether there was any meaningful competition for resources at the margins between the aquatic and terrestrial environments, is entirely invisible in the fossil record. Modern large predators that share overlapping habitats generally avoid each other when possible, because the cost of injury in a fight between two animals of similar size and weaponry is prohibitively high for both. The same logic almost certainly applied in the chem-chem, but logic is not direct evidence, and direct evidence of predator-predator interaction between Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus has not been found. In South America, during the same broad period, another Carcharodontosaurid was pursuing its own version of apex predation. Giganotosaurus carolini, described from Argentina in 1995 by Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado, was a massive predator estimated at approximately 12 to 13 meters in length. Comparable to or slightly exceeding Tyrannosaurus in linear dimension, if not in mass. Like Carcharodontosaurus, Giganotosaurus had the blade-like, laterally compressed teeth and long skull of a predator targeting large prey, and the titanosaur sauropods of South America, some of the largest animals ever to walk on land, provided a prey base of sufficient size to sustain a predator of Giganotosaurus's dimensions. The discovery of Giganotosaurus was significant partly because it provided a South American counterpart to the North African Carcharodontosaurus, confirming that the Carcharodontosaurid lineage had achieved a truly global distribution of enormous predators during the Middle Cretaceous, a distribution that was entirely displaced and replaced by the Tyrannosaurids in the northern continents during the later Cretaceous. Why the Tyrannosaurids eventually displaced the Carcharodontosaurids in the northern landmasses, and why the Carcharodontosaurids persisted in South America and Africa while Tyrannosaurids remained absent from those continents, is a question that touches on continental biogeography, the history of land connections between the major landmasses during the Cretaceous, and the competitive dynamics of two successful predator lineages. The continents were not in their modern configurations during the Cretaceous, and the land connections and barriers between them changed over time, shaping which lineages could disperse where. North America and Asia maintained intermittent land connections that allowed faunal exchange, including the exchange of tyrannosaurid lineages between the two continents, while South America and Africa were already more isolated, maintaining their Carcharodontosaurid predator guilds without the tyrannosaurid competition that would have been present had land connections allowed dispersal. The result was a global predator fauna in which different lineages of large theropods dominated different continental regions, each evolving in the context of its own prey community and its own ecological pressures, producing parallel but distinct solutions to the problem of being a very large carnivore. There is also the matter of what came before both of these animals in the longer sweep of theropod evolution, because the large predatory theropods of the Cretaceous did not appear from nowhere. They descended from a lineage of bipedal carnivores that had been diversifying and experimenting with size and specialization since the Triassic, more than 200 million years ago. The earliest theropods were small, gracile animals, and the evolution of large body size happened independently in multiple theropod lineages during the Jurassic and Cretaceous, a repeated pattern of size increase that suggests that being very large conferred consistent ecological advantages in the kinds of communities that dinosaurs were building. Allosaurus, the dominant predator of the late Jurassic Morrison Formation of North America, reached lengths of 9 to 10 meters and was the ecological predecessor, though not the direct ancestor, of the even larger predators of the Cretaceous. The Jurassic world had its own version of the apex predator guild, with multiple large theropods partitioning the predator space of a rich ecosystem full of enormous sauropods and large ornithopods, and the basic ecological logic of that guild, one or a few very large theropods at the apex with smaller predators filling the intermediate niches, persisted through the Cretaceous into the final catastrophic chapter of non-avian dinosaur history. There is a human story running through all of this, a story about the scientists and collectors who have spent their careers on their knees in the dust of 4 continents, prying fragments of lost worlds from ancient rock, and the way that story has shaped what we know and what we still do not know about both of these animals. Because the fossil record is not simply there, waiting to be read. It has to be found, and found again, and found again, and each discovery rewrites what the previous one established. The history of how we came to understand Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus is itself a story about the nature of scientific knowledge, about how incomplete data can seem complete until the next piece of evidence arrives to overturn it. Tyrannosaurus Rex was formally described in 1905 by Henry Fairfield Osborn, then the president of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. But the story of its discovery begins a few years earlier, with Barnum Brown, one of the most colorful and prolific fossil hunters in the history of American paleontology. Brown, who worked for the American Museum and had a remarkable instinct for finding fossils in promising formations, collected the first partial Tyrannosaurus skeleton from the Hell Creek Formation of Montana in 1902. A second, more complete specimen followed in 1905. Osborn named the animal and wrote the scientific description, but it was Brown who found it, working in conditions that required traveling by horse and mule across remote badlands, sleeping in tents, handling enormous, heavy bones with the primitive excavation technology of the early 20th century. Brown continued collecting Tyrannosaurus material for decades, and his specimens formed the core of what would become one of the most important collections of dinosaur material in the world. The subsequent century of Tyrannosaurus discovery has been remarkable in its productivity. The Hell Creek Formation, now known to be a particularly rich source of latest Cretaceous material, has been systematically excavated by teams from multiple institutions since Barnum Brown's first expeditions, and the number of Tyrannosaurus specimens has grown to the point where statistical analyses of the species are now possible in a way that was unimaginable when only a handful of specimens were known. The discovery of Sue, the most complete Tyrannosaurus skeleton ever found in 1990 by Sue Hendrickson in South Dakota, was a landmark moment, not just scientifically but also legally and commercially, because the subsequent dispute over ownership of the specimen between the fossil hunter who found it, the landowner on whose property it was found, the Sioux tribe on whose reservation the land was located, and various commercial interests, became a legal case that went to the federal courts and ultimately resulted in the specimen being auctioned at Sotheby's in 1997 for a price of $8.3 million, then a record for a fossil. The Field Museum in Chicago, which purchased Sue, has since made the specimen available for scientific study and has allowed extensive research that would not have been possible if it had gone to a private collection. The skeleton, mounted in the museum's Stanley Field Hall, has been seen by millions of visitors and has probably done more to bring Tyrannosaurus into the consciousness of the general public than any other single specimen. The discovery history of Spinosaurus is in some ways more dramatic, and certainly more tragic. Ernst Stromer, who first described the animal, was a man of the Wilhelmina era of German science, meticulous and systematic, and deeply committed to the paleontological documentation of African Cretaceous life. His expeditions to Egypt, and the material collected by his preparator Richard Markgraf in the years before the First World War, produced some of the most important theropod fossils ever found, not just Spinosaurus but also Carcharodontosaurus and several other large predatory dinosaurs. Stromer recognized the significance of what he had found and worked carefully to describe and document it. The Spinosaurus description in 1915 was a careful, measured piece of scientific work, given the limitations of the material. And then the war came, and then the Weimar Republic, and then the rise of the Nazis, and Stromer, who was openly opposed to the regime, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His son was killed in the Second World War. His collection was destroyed in the bombing of Munich in 1944. Stromer himself survived the war but died in 1952, having seen the work of his career reduced to paper records and plaster casts. The story of the original Spinosaurus material is a story about how political catastrophe can erase scientific knowledge, and about how resilient that knowledge can sometimes prove despite the loss of the physical evidence. The recovery of Spinosaurus to scientific understanding was a slow process. New material from Morocco and other parts of North Africa trickled in over the decades following the war, but nothing that dramatically changed the picture Stromer had established. Spinosaurus remained a large, sail-backed theropod of uncertain habits and incomplete anatomy. The transformation came with the work of Nizar Ibrahim, a German-Moroccan paleontologist whose personal connection to North Africa gave him access to the Moroccan fossil market that most Western researchers lacked. Ibrahim's account of how the new Spinosaurus material was assembled reads almost like a detective story. Parts of a single skeleton had been collected by local fossil hunters and sold in pieces to different buyers. Ibrahim tracked the specimens across multiple locations, eventually connecting a crucial pelvic and leg element held by a private collector in Italy to the skull and vertebral material that had reached researchers through other channels. The process required years of correspondence, international travel, delicate negotiation, and a considerable amount of scientific intuition about which fragmentary pieces might belong to the same individual. When the material was finally assembled and described in 2014, the result was a reconstruction that no one had anticipated, and that has been generating debate ever since. The ongoing scientific discussion about Spinosaurus's lifestyle and anatomy is itself a model of how science actually works, which is rarely as simple as a single paper announcing a final answer. The 2014 Ibrahim paper generated responses, critiques, and counter-arguments from multiple researchers in multiple countries. Donald Henderson of the Royal Tyrrell Museum questioned the aquatic hypothesis on biomechanical grounds, arguing that the reconstructed body proportions would not actually have made Spinosaurus an efficient swimmer. Mark Whitten and others examined the available evidence for aquatic adaptation more carefully and offered nuanced assessments of which features were genuinely diagnostic of aquatic lifestyle and which were ambiguous. Paul Serino and Ibrahim's team responded to these critiques with additional analysis. The 2020 paper on the tail anatomy, published in Nature, added significant new evidence, and the discussion continued in its wake. This is not a failure of science. It is science functioning exactly as it should, with new evidence prompting new interpretation, and interpretation being tested against additional evidence and against alternative explanations. The Spinosaurus debate has produced a richer and more textured understanding of the animal than any single unchallenged paper could have done. The contrast between the discovery histories of the two animals tells us something important about the structure of our knowledge. Tyrannosaurus, found in the rich and accessible Hell Creek Formation of North America, has been studied by generations of researchers with access to multiple specimens, modern laboratory equipment, and a long tradition of scientific infrastructure. The knowledge base for Tyrannosaurus is therefore unusually solid by the standards of large extinct vertebrates. The Spinosaurus knowledge base is more fragile, more contingent on the specific circumstances of collection and preservation, more subject to revision as new material is found, and more dependent on the personal and sometimes hazardous fieldwork of researchers operating in geopolitically complex parts of the world. The chem beds, the primary source of new Spinosaurus material, are in a region that has not always been easy for international research teams to access, and where the fossil trade sometimes removes material from scientific reach before it can be properly documented and described. Every new Spinosaurus specimen that enters the scientific literature does so against the background of an unknown number of specimens that have already left Morocco in collectors' luggage and will never be formally studied. This is one of the less romantic aspects of paleontology, but one of the most important. The reality that the scientific record of any extinct animal is profoundly shaped by accidents of geography, politics, economics, and preservation that have nothing to do with how significant or how interesting the animal itself was. The Hell Creek Formation is scientifically tractable, partly because it is located in a politically stable country with a strong tradition of academic science and good infrastructure for field research. The Kem is scientifically challenging, partly because it is located in a region where fossil poaching is economically attractive and the resources for enforcement are limited. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This shapes what we know. It shapes our perception of which animals are well understood and which are mysterious. And it is a reminder that the fossil record is not a neutral sample of prehistoric life. It is a deeply biased sample, skewed by all the contingencies of death and preservation and discovery and academic access that have filtered it through millions of years of geological and human history before it reached the laboratory. There is a person in this story who deserves a moment of attention for what their experience tells us about the human dimension of paleontological knowledge. Richard Markgraf was not a scientist. He was a skilled collector, an Austrian national living in Egypt who worked for Stroma as a field agent, travelling to the Bahariya Formation repeatedly in the years before the First World War and shipping the material he found back to Munich. The original Spinosaurus specimens, the material that was destroyed in 1944, came from Markgraf's hands. His collecting notes, his field observations, the careful documentation that would have allowed later researchers to understand the exact provenance and articulation of the original material. These have mostly not survived either. We know that Spinosaurus came from the Bahariya Formation. We do not know, in precise detail, how the original skeleton was oriented in the rock, which bones were found in articulation and which were scattered, what the surrounding matrix and associated fauna looked like at the time of collection. This information, had it been preserved, might have resolved some of the ongoing debates about the animal's anatomy and lifestyle. But it was not preserved because Markgraf was a collector operating in an era when field documentation was not yet the systematic practice it has since become. The absence of that information is a gap in this scientific record that no amount of subsequent fieldwork can fully fill, because the original context of the original material is gone forever, along with the bones themselves. One of the most profound shifts in how we understand both of these animals over the last several decades has been the growing recognition that they were not the cold-blooded, sluggish reptiles of earlier imagination. This deserves careful treatment, because the question of metabolism and physiology in large Mesozoic theropods is genuinely complex, and the popular version of the story, which tends toward the simple claim that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, just like us, elides considerable scientific nuance. But the direction of the evidence is clear enough to state with confidence. Large theropods, including both Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus, were almost certainly not the ectotherms, the cold-blooded animals in the conventional sense that earlier generations of paleontologists assumed. The evidence comes from multiple independent lines of research. Growth ring analysis, which we have already touched on in the context of Tyrannosaurus lifespan, reveals growth rates that are inconsistent with the slow, temperature-dependent growth typical of living reptiles. Modern ectotherms like crocodilians grow slowly, with growth rates tightly tied to ambient temperature and food availability. The growth rings in Tyrannosaurus bones show that the animal was adding enormous amounts of mass per year during peak growth. rates that are more comparable to those of large, warm-blooded mammals like African elephants than to those of any living reptile. Growing that fast requires generating your own body heat because the biochemical processes that build tissue rapidly require sustained high temperatures that an ectotherm cannot maintain independently. Bone histology, the microscopic structure of the bone tissue itself, also shows features associated with rapid, sustained growth in warm-blooded animals, including a texture called fibrolamellar bone that is characteristic of high metabolic rate. The bone texture of Tyrannosaurus is, in this respect, much more like that of a modern bird or mammal than like that of a modern reptile. The evidence for feathers in at least some large theropods, and the phylogenetic position of Tyrannosaurus within the Coelurosaur group that gave rise to modern birds, also speaks to the metabolic question. Feathers are fundamentally thermoregulatory structures in their origin, insulating the body and retaining heat generated by internal metabolic processes. You do not need insulation if you are not generating heat. The presence of feather-like filaments in early tyrannosauroids like Yutyrannus strongly suggests that the ancestral condition in the lineage included at least some degree of insulative covering, which implies at least some degree of endothermy, the technical term for generating your own body heat internally. Whether large adult Tyrannosaurus retained significant feather coverage is debated, as we have discussed, but the physiological basis for at least partially warm-blooded metabolism seems well established. For Spinosaurus, the metabolic question is similarly complex. The bone histology of Spinosaurid material, where it has been studied, shows features consistent with elevated metabolic rates compared to modern reptiles, though the data are less extensive than for Tyrannosaurus given the more fragmentary nature of the material. The dense bone structure that Ibrahim and colleagues cited as evidence for aquatic ballasting also has some bearing on the metabolic question, because bone density is partly a function of mineral deposition rates that are influenced by metabolic rate. But the aquatic lifestyle hypothesis itself raises interesting thermoregulatory questions. Water is an excellent conductor of heat, removing body heat from an animal far more rapidly than air at the same temperature. Modern large aquatic endotherms, like crocodilians, which are actually more complex metabolically than the simple cold-blooded label suggests, use behavioral thermoregulation extensively, basking in sunlight to warm up and entering water to cool down. Whether Spinosaurus had any behavioral thermoregulatory strategies, and how its thermal physiology was calibrated to the warm equatorial waters of its environment, are questions that the fossil record cannot currently answer with any precision. The sensory world of these animals is another dimension of their lives that has become much better understood in recent years, primarily through the application of CT scanning technology to fossil skulls and brain cases. The brain case, the bony capsule that surrounded and protected the brain, preserves information about the size and shape of different brain regions, which in turn gives us some insight into the relative development of different sensory capabilities. The olfactory bulbs, which process smell information, the optic lobes, which process visual information, and the cochlear ducts, which tell us about hearing, all leave impressions on the inner surface of the brain case that can be reconstructed from CT scan data to produce what researchers call a digital endocast, a three-dimensional model of the brain's exterior surface. The olfactory bulbs of Tyrannosaurus, as revealed by endocast work carried out by researchers including Lawrence Whitmer at Ohio University, were very large, proportionally among the largest known for any theropod dinosaur. This strongly suggests that smell was an important sensory channel for Tyrannosaurus, possibly as important as, or more important than vision in certain contexts, particularly for locating food at a distance. Modern birds, which are the closest living relatives of non-avian dinosaurs, use olfaction to highly variable degrees. Vultures, which locate carcasses from great distances, have well-developed olfactory systems. Many raptors and other predatory birds rely more heavily on vision, Tyrannosaurus, with its large olfactory bulbs, was probably more in the vulture tradition in terms of olfactory capability, even if it was also an active predator rather than a dedicated scavenger. The visual system of Tyrannosaurus has been analysed by Kent Stevens, who created detailed reconstructions of the visual fields of various dinosaurs based on the positioning and orientation of the orbits. His analysis suggested that Tyrannosaurus had a degree of binocular overlap, the region where the visual fields of the two eyes overlap, and where depth perception is possible. That was significantly larger than in most other theropods, and comparable to that of modern predatory birds like hawks and eagles. This frontal-facing visual system is a hallmark of active predators that need to judge distances accurately. Whether for striking at prey, navigating through complex terrain, or assessing conspecifics, the combination of acute smell and frontal vision in Tyrannosaurus suggests an animal with a sophisticated, multimodal sensory system that was well integrated in service of predation. For Spinosaurus, sensory reconstruction is more difficult because the skull material, while including substantial portions of the rostral region, is less completely preserved in terms of the brain case. The position of the nostrils on the Spinosaurus skull, set far back from the tip of the snout compared to most other theropods, is itself a sensory adaptation consistent with aquatic foraging. An animal that holds its snout partially submerged while searching for fish benefits from having nostrils positioned well back from the water surface, allowing it to breathe while its rostrum is still in the water. This is precisely the nostril position seen in crocodilians and many other aquatic vertebrates that breathe air but hunt underwater or at the water surface. The conical, interlocking teeth of Spinosaurus would have provided excellent grip on slippery prey, minimizing the risk of a large fish escaping once contact was made. Whether Spinosaurus also used visual or olfactory cues to locate fish in turbid water, or whether it used some form of pressure-sensitive mechanoreception similar to the lateral line sensory system of fish themselves, or the pressure-sensitive scales on the snout of crocodilians, is an intriguing possibility that the fossil record cannot currently confirm or exclude. The question of behavior is where the limits of paleontological inference become most apparent. We can reconstruct anatomy with reasonable confidence from good fossil material. We can make inferences about diet from tooth morphology, gut contents, and coprolites. We can make cautious inferences about physiology from bone histology and growth rates. But behavior, the full range of what an animal actually did with its life, its social interactions, its reproductive strategies, its daily rhythms, its individual responses to its environment, is almost entirely invisible in the fossil record. What we can say is that both Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus were large-brained by dinosaurian standards, that both had sensory systems suggesting active and sophisticated interaction with their environments, and that both, as large-bodied animals with high metabolic demands, would have spent a substantial portion of their time and energy in the business of finding and consuming food. Beyond that, the behavioral canvas is largely blank, available to be filled by imagination but not by data. The one behavioral inference that seems relatively secure for Tyrannosaurus is that it engaged in intraspecific competition of some kind, competition between individuals of the same species, based on the bone pathologies observed in multiple specimens. Healed bite marks on the faces and jaws of some Tyrannosaurus specimens, with spacing and dimensions consistent with Tyrannosaurus teeth, suggest that these animals bit each other, possibly in the context of territorial disputes, competition for mates, or hierarchical interactions within a social group. This kind of behavior is common among large modern predators and is not surprising to find evidence of in the fossil record of a large, socially complex theropod. The healed nature of the wounds indicates that the bitten individual survived, which means that these interactions, whatever their context, were not routinely lethal. They may have been more ritualized than the popular image of two Tyrannosaurus fighting to the death suggests, with animals displaying, posturing, and exchanging symbolic bites rather than engaging in all-out combat that neither could afford to sustain, given the cost of serious injury to a large predator. Both of these animals ended. Every species that has ever lived has ended, or is ending slowly, or will end. The rule is absolute and has not had an exception in 4 billion years of life on Earth. But the manner and timing of ending matters, and the ends of Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus are as different as the animals themselves, as different as the worlds that produced them. Spinosaurus, so far as the evidence can tell us, simply ran out of world. The Chem-Chem ecosystem, that vast, warm, productive floodplain that had sustained an extraordinary community of enormous predators and enormous prey for millions of years, changed. The sea levels were shifting throughout the Cretaceous, and the shallow seaways and river systems that had created the productive lowland environment of the Cenomanian were retreating and changing character during the later Cretaceous. The large spinosaurids gradually disappear from the fossil record, with the most recent members of the family known from deposits significantly older than the end Cretaceous extinction event that wiped out Tyrannosaurus and most other non-avian dinosaurs. Spinosaurus did not survive to the final catastrophe. It and its immediate relatives were already gone before the asteroid arrived, lost to the slower, quieter processes of habitat change and ecological disruption that accompany long-term geological and climatic shifts. Whether the last Spinosaurus individual died in a drying river, stranded by a receding flood system, or whether the population declined gradually over millions of years as the productive ecosystem that sustained it contracted, is not recorded in any bone we have found. The end of Spinosaurus is as invisible in the fossil record as most endings are, an absence rather than a documented event. Tyrannosaurus, by contrast, was there at the end. It was one of the last and most spectacularly developed non-avian dinosaurs, reaching its peak in the final few million years of the Cretaceous before the Chicxulub impactor changed everything. The bolide, a large asteroid or comet approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico approximately 66 million years ago, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 10 billion times the power of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The immediate effects were catastrophic on a planetary scale. The impact generated enormous wildfires, massive tsunami waves, and an impact winter caused by the injection of enormous quantities of dust, sulfur compounds, and soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight for months to years and causing a dramatic global cooling. The photosynthesis-dependent base of the food web collapsed. Plants died. Herbivores that depended on plants died. Predators that depended on herbivores died. The end Cretaceous mass extinction, sometimes called the KPG extinction, eliminated approximately 75% of all species on Earth, including all non-avian dinosaurs and the marine reptiles, the pterosaurs, and many other groups that had dominated Mesozoic ecosystems for over 100 million years. Among the last survivors to be extinguished were the large charismatic species of the Hell Creek Formation. Triceratops died, Edmontosaurus died, and Tyrannosaurus Rex, the most powerful terrestrial predator the world had produced, died. Not in individual combat with a worthy opponent, not even from some internal crisis in the ecology of its home, but from the cold and the dark that followed a rock falling from space. The last Tyrannosaurus individuals were probably healthy, probably still hunting, probably still fully functional as predators when the sky began to change in ways that no behavioral adaptation could cope with, and no evolutionary innovation could address quickly enough. The extinction was not about fitness. Fitness is measured within an environment. When the environment itself ceases to exist in any recognizable form, fitness becomes irrelevant. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Tyrannosaurus Rex spent roughly 2 million years as the dominant apex predator of its ecosystem, shaped by and shaping one of the richest terrestrial communities in Mesozoic history. It was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily successful at what it did. And all of that success, all of that evolutionary refinement, all of those millions of years of selection pressure producing the bone-crushing jaws, and the binocular vision, and the powerful olfaction, and the enormous body, mattered not at all when a random extraterrestrial object of sufficient size happened to intersect with Earth's orbit at a particular moment in geological time. This is one of the more humbling insights that paleontology offers. The most successful lineage in an ecosystem, the animal most perfectly adapted to its world, can be destroyed by an event that has nothing to do with ecological fitness, nothing to do with predator-prey dynamics or competition or disease, and everything to do with physics and geometry and the indifferent randomness of celestial mechanics. What survived the end Cretaceous extinction did so not because it was superior to what it replaced, but because it happened to have characteristics that allowed it to get through the bottleneck. Small body size was enormously advantageous because small animals require less food and can survive on smaller, more sporadic resources during the lean years of an impact winter. Omnivory was advantageous because animals that could eat insects, seeds, fungi, and decaying organic matter were not dependent on a functioning plant herbivore predator chain that had collapsed. The ancestors of modern mammals, small and mostly nocturnal and largely insectivorous, had these characteristics. So did the avian dinosaurs. The birds, which descended from small feathered theropods, relate to the dromaeosaurids of the Cretaceous, and which survived the extinction to diversify into the 10,000 or so living bird species of the modern world. The non-avian dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus, were large, specialized, and dependent on a food web that the impact destroyed. They had no path through the bottleneck. Their world simply ended, and the world that replaced it had no place for them. There is something poignant in the recognition that both Spinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus are, in a sense, evolutionary dead ends. Not because they were failures, but because the lineages that might have carried their specific evolutionary innovations forward were terminated, one by gradual ecological change and one by catastrophe, before those innovations could be tested against other environments and other challenges. We will never know what a Spinosaurus descendant adapted to drier, cooler conditions might have looked like, or whether the Spinosaurid ecological strategy could have persisted into a different kind of Cenozoic world. We will never know whether Tyrannosaurus or its descendants, given another 10 or 20 million years of Cretaceous-like conditions, might have evolved toward greater intelligence, more complex social behavior, or more sophisticated predatory strategies. Those futures were cut off. What remains are the fossils, the fragments of bone and teeth and skin impression and coprolite that record what these animals actually were in their actual world, for the actual duration of their existence, before the record ends. The birds, the surviving dinosaurs, are the most direct living connection to the world of Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus. When you hear a crow or a raven, you're hearing a sound produced by an animal whose ancestors shared the Cretaceous world with these enormous predators. When you watch a heron stalking fish in a shallow marsh, holding still with preternatural patience before striking with a long, narrow bill at a passing prey item, you are watching a behavior that has a very deep resonance with what we believe Spinosaurus was doing in the warm rivers of Cretaceous Africa. The strategies are different in scale, enormously different in scale, but the ecological role is recognizable. A large bird using a long, narrow, tooth-edged bill to catch fish in shallow water. Spinosaurus was not a bird, and the lineage is not a direct ancestor of any living bird, but the ecological convergence is striking, and the evolutionary logic is the same. Fish are there. They are abundant. They can be caught with the right morphology. Something large evolved to catch them. Modern crocodilians, which are themselves archosaurs, and therefore the closest living relatives of the non-avian dinosaurs along with birds, maintain an ecological presence in some of the world's river systems that gives us a partial window into the kind of aquatic apex predator niche that Spinosaurus occupied. A large saltwater crocodile in a productive river system in northern Australia is at the apex of the aquatic food web, capable of taking prey ranging from large fish to terrestrial mammals that approach the water. Its patience, its camouflage, its explosive strike, and its bone-crushing bite force are all adaptations to the same fundamental ecological challenge that Spinosaurus faced. And the crocodilian solution to that challenge has proven so effective that the basic body plan has persisted essentially unchanged for over 80 million years. Spinosaurus was not a crocodilian and was not closely related to one, but in the fundamental ecological logic of its existence, in the adaptive solution to the problem of being a large, air-breathing vertebrate in a warm, productive river system full of enormous fish, it arrived at a solution that has independent parallels in the crocodilian lineage and continues to resonate in the modern world. There is a version of this story that exists entirely outside the fossil record, in the imagination of the people who have encountered these animals through books and films and museums and toys. And that version deserves its own examination, because it tells us something about ourselves that the bones alone cannot. Tyrannosaurus Rex and Spinosaurus are not simply extinct animals in the popular mind. They are characters. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. They are characters, archetypes, symbols carrying specific emotional weight that has been built up over more than a century of encounters between these fossils and the human beings who found them. Tyrannosaurus entered the popular consciousness with extraordinary speed and power. Osborne's 1905 description was covered by newspapers in New York and beyond, and the mounted skeleton at the American Museum of Natural History, completed in 1915 using the brown specimens and incorporating some creative artistic license in the pose, became one of the most visited museum exhibits in the world. The upright tail-dragging pose of that early mount was anatomically incorrect. We now know that Tyrannosaurus held its body horizontal with the tail extended for balance, rather than dragging on the ground, but it created a specific visual image, towering and bipedal and threatening, that proved extraordinarily persistent in the popular imagination. Illustrations, sculptures, films, and eventually television programs reproduced and amplified this image for decades, so that by the time Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park appeared in 1993, Tyrannosaurus Rex was already one of the most universally recognized animal images in human culture, recognized by people who had never visited a museum and had no particular interest in natural history. The film, with its groundbreaking computer-generated imagery and its viscerally terrifying depictions of the animal in motion, brought a new generation into direct emotional contact with the creature, and the specific terror of the Tyrannosaurus attack sequence, the vibrating water in the cup, the enormous eye reflecting light in the darkness. The roar that felt physical became one of the defining cinematic experiences of the 1990s. Spinosaurus arrived in the popular imagination later and less gracefully. For most of the 20th century, it was a footnote, mentioned in dinosaur books as an interesting sail-backed theropod from Africa, but rarely depicted in the kind of dramatic detail reserved for Tyrannosaurus and a handful of other famous species. The 2001 film Jurassic Park 3 changed this, and not in a way that paleontologists appreciated. The film's dramatic centerpiece was a fight between a Spinosaurus and a Tyrannosaurus, which the Spinosaurus won by breaking the Tyrannosaurus's neck. The Spinosaurus in the film was depicted as larger, stronger, and more aggressive than Tyrannosaurus, and it appeared at intervals throughout the film as the primary animal threat. This sequence was, as we have discussed, anatomically and ecologically problematic in multiple ways, and it provoked genuine frustration among paleontologists who felt that the film had misrepresented both animals in service of a dramatic spectacle. But it also introduced Spinosaurus to a global audience of millions, giving it a cultural presence that it had never previously enjoyed, even if that presence was built on a foundation of scientific inaccuracy. The subsequent 2014 revelations about Spinosaurus' anatomy and lifestyle created a second wave of popular interest, this time more scientifically grounded, but equally dramatic in its own way. The image of Spinosaurus as a quadrupedal or semi-quadrupedal aquatic predator was, in many respects, more alien and more visually striking than the simple, large, upright theropod of the Jurassic Park 3 depiction. The reconstructions produced by Ibrahim and his colleagues, working with artists and with digital modeling tools that had not been available to earlier generations of scientists, presented a Spinosaurus that looked like nothing anyone had imagined before. Low-slung, short-legged, with a massive sail and a long crocodilian snout, haunting shallow water in a Saharan floodplain that no longer exists. The image went viral in a media landscape that could spread it instantly, and the popular conversation about Spinosaurus shifted from the crude Jurassic Park 3 narrative to something genuinely more interesting. The story of a scientific revolution mid-process. An animal being fundamentally reconceived as new evidence emerged. This is worth noticing, because it represents a change in how popular audiences engage with paleontology that has been building for the last several decades. The Jurassic Park era of the 1990s and 2000s brought a general public understanding that our knowledge of dinosaurs is not fixed, that new discoveries change the picture, that the dinosaurs of one generation's imagination might look very different from the dinosaurs of the next. The feathered dinosaur revolution, which gathered momentum through the 1990s with the discovery of astonishingly preserved feathered theropods from the Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province in China, made this especially vivid. Suddenly the raptors of Jurassic Park needed feathers. Suddenly the entire theropod body plan needed to be reconsidered in light of the bird connection. The public, to its enormous credit, largely embraced this revision rather than resisting it. The combination of genuinely dramatic new discoveries and a media ecosystem capable of conveying their significance has made the last 3 decades an unusually exciting period to be both a paleontologist and a person with even casual interest in prehistoric life. The ongoing Spinosaurus debate participates in this tradition. The argument between researchers about the aquatic lifestyle hypothesis, conducted partly in peer-reviewed journals and partly in more public forums, has drawn interested observers who do not have advanced degrees in paleontology, but who can follow the logic of the competing arguments well enough to have informed opinions. This democratization of scientific debate, for all its complications and occasional missteps, has produced a public engagement with paleontological research that is genuinely different from the passive reception of authoritative pronouncements that characterized earlier decades. People now argue about Spinosaurus's leg proportions on the internet with the same energy they bring to other passionate disputes. And while not all of those arguments are conducted with perfect accuracy, many of them reflect a real and substantive engagement with the scientific questions at stake. The cultural meaning of these two animals has also evolved in ways that reflect changing anxieties and fascinations in the broader culture. Tyrannosaurus, in the period from its discovery through the mid-20th century, was often interpreted as a symbol of power, pure and simple, the ultimate predator, the king, the apex. In an era when the conquest of nature by industrial civilization was considered straightforwardly positive, the image of an enormous, unstoppable predator was a kind of mirror for human ambition. Proof that nature itself contained the principle of total dominance. The Jurassic Park era brought a more ambivalent reading. The Tyrannosaurus of that film is terrifying, but it is also, in some sequences, depicted with a kind of magnificent wildness that the film's human characters respect even as they flee it. The sequence in which the Tyrannosaurus kills the velociraptors at the end of the original film, while explicitly saving the human protagonists, is one of cinema's most interesting moments of ambivalent predator representation. The animal is doing something terrible and something magnificent at the same moment, and the film holds both responses simultaneously without resolving them. Spinosaurus, by contrast, has never quite accumulated the same depth of cultural resonance, perhaps because its history in popular culture is shorter and more turbulent. It arrived as a villain in Jurassic Park 3, was revised into something stranger and more alien by the scientific revelations of 2014, and now occupies a peculiar position in the popular imagination as an animal that is simultaneously very famous and very poorly understood by most of the people who know its name. The Spinosaurus of the public mind is often still the Jurassic Park 3 Spinosaurus, large and aggressive, and Tyrannosaurus defeating, even though the scientific understanding of the animal has moved so far from that depiction that the two are barely recognizable as the same creature. This gap between popular image and scientific understanding is not unique to Spinosaurus, but it is particularly wide in this case, and it creates an interesting dynamic in which the most informed discussions of the animal require first dismantling the mental image that most people bring to the conversation. There is something democratically instructive in the fact that both of these animals are genuinely still being understood. The bones of Tyrannosaurus Rex, the most intensively studied large theropod in history, are still yielding new information about growth rates, physiology, and individual variation. The bones and their geological context continue to be reanalyzed with new techniques, producing revisions to estimates of lifespan, maximum size, locomotor capacity, and metabolic rate. Spinosaurus, far less completely known, is essentially being reconstructed in real time as new material emerges from the chem and new analytical tools are applied to both the new and the old material. The animals are not finished. Our understanding of them is a work in progress, and the next significant fossil discovery in either the Hell Creek Formation or the chem could meaningfully change the picture. This is the condition of all knowledge about the deep past, and it is in some ways the most honest thing that can be said about these extraordinary animals. We know more about them than any previous generation of humans has known. We know vastly less than we would like to know, and vastly less than a complete record would allow us to know. What remains, after all the analysis and all the debate, is a profound, genuine, partly answered and partly unanswerable question about two of the most remarkable animals that have ever lived on this planet. Animals whose existence tells us something real and important about what life can become when evolution has sufficient time and sufficient pressure and sufficient ecological opportunity to explore its own possibilities. Let the question dissolve now, the one that started all of this. Who ruled the prehistoric world? Let it dissolve, not because it was a bad question, but because the pursuit of it has led somewhere more interesting than any simple answer could have done. It has led to two worlds, two Cretaceous landscapes, separated by geography and 30 million years of unshared history, each producing its own extraordinary solution to the problem of predation, each sustaining its apex predator for millions of years of ecological complexity and individual drama that no fossil can more than hint at. Somewhere in what is now the Moroccan desert, in rock that was once riverbank sediment laid down in a warm, equatorial floodplain, there are probably Spinosaurus bones that have not yet been found. They are waiting in the dark of the rock, compressed and mineralized and patient, as they have been waiting for 95 million years. They were there when the Romans built their roads across North Africa. They were there when the Saharan climate dried and the desert formed over the ancient floodplain that had been their animals' home. They were there when the first modern humans moved across this landscape, and when the first farmers planted grain, and when the first cities rose along the rivers to the east, and when the first scientists began to suspect that the bones emerging from the eroded rock might tell a story worth hearing. They are still there. Some of them will eventually reach the surface, will be found by someone with the knowledge to recognize them, will be documented and analyzed and described, and we'll add another fragment to the incomplete picture we are still assembling of an animal that lived and moved and hunted and died in a world that no human being ever saw. Somewhere in the Badlands of Montana or South Dakota or Wyoming, in the dark red and grey sediments of the Hell Creek Formation, there are Tyrannosaurus bones that have not yet been found. They are there too, 66 million years deep, waiting. The animal they came from walked over a landscape that no human ancestor ever walked, breathed air that no human ancestor ever breathed, and died before the first primate that could be called even remotely human had yet evolved anywhere on the planet. The distance between that animal's last breath and your first one is almost incomprehensibly large, a canyon of time so wide that almost everything that is familiar to you about the living world, the flowers, the grasses, the mice, the songbirds, the smell of rain on warm earth, did not yet exist when Tyrannosaurus walked the coastal plain of Laramidia. And yet, here you are, lying in the dark, thinking about it, reaching back across that impossible distance with the specific human capacity for temporal imagination, the ability to care about what happened long before you were born, to feel something, some version of wonder or sorrow or simple awe, for creatures that you will never see, that no one will ever see, and that existed so completely on their own terms, in their own world, without any reference to or awareness of the world you inhabit tonight. This reaching back is itself one of the most remarkable things about being human. Every other species on this planet lives, as far as we can determine, entirely within the present tense. The crow remembers where it hid its food. The elephant remembers where the water was last dry season. But no other animal that we know of lies awake at night, thinking about an animal that died 95 million years ago, and wonders what it was like. No other animal has built museums and academic journals and international scientific collaborations dedicated to recovering the details of a world that ended before any of the animals currently alive on Earth had evolved. This is unusual. This is, when you examine it, deeply strange. And it is also, in some way that resists precise articulation, one of the things that makes being a conscious creature in this particular moment of Earth's history genuinely extraordinary. The world that produced Spinosaurus is gone. The floodplain is desert now, and then under it, buried deeper than any river, is the rock that was once riverbank mud. And in that rock are the bones. The world that produced Tyrannosaurus is gone. The western interior seaway has long since drained. The coastal plain is elevated now, eroded into the badlands that Barnum Brown crossed on horseback more than 100 years ago. The animals themselves are gone, not just dead in the way that individual animals die, but gone in the deeper sense that their lineages terminated, that no descendant carries their particular evolutionary inheritance forward. What remains is the rock, and the bones within the rock, and the human curiosity that keeps returning to the rock with tools and patience, and a desire to understand what was there before we were. Rest now. Let the Cretaceous settle quietly around you. Let the image of a warm, shallow river in what will one day be the Sahara form in the dark behind your eyes. The water murky and warm. The vegetation at the margins dense and unfamiliar. A great sail moving slowly through the shallows. Let the image of a late afternoon on a coastal plain 66 million years ago take shape gently. The air heavy with moisture. A herd of hadrosaurs moving toward water, and somewhere in the tree line, patient and almost perfectly still, something very large, watching. These worlds existed. They were real. They had their own complete, self-contained drama and beauty and violence and quietness that we are only beginning to recover in fragments. You are connected to them, not by blood, not by lineage, but by curiosity and time and the specific human privilege of knowing that you exist within a history vastly older than yourself. That history was here long before you arrived, and it will go on being here, in the rock and the bones, and the unasked questions, long after tonight becomes morning, and the questions about ancient predators give way to the smaller and more immediate concerns of being alive in this moment, on this world, in this brief and remarkable span of time that is yours. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.